I grew up in a modest town roughly 50 miles from the Gulf Coast, surrounded by dense woodland and stretches of open fields. My father, whose name was Raymond, taught me to track white-tailed deer when I was 7, and he showed me how to handle a rifle soon after that. He explained the importance of patience and observation, and he insisted I learn to recognize every subtle sign on the ground. He pointed out broken twigs, tufts of fur caught on fences, and footprints that gave away the habits of local wildlife. He believed that details mattered more than anything else, and I tried to follow his guidance whenever I walked those old trails with him. Our property measured about 5 acres, which felt large to me as a child, and I remember crossing it with a sense of deep respect. My father believed that routine maintenance of fences, feeders, and water troughs was as essential as carrying a clean weapon. I spent my early years helping my father check on our hounds, feed them, and observe their behavior. I learned that each dog possessed a unique temperament. One responded best to gentle correction, while another required a firm approach, but never cruel treatment. We never rushed training. We allowed the dogs to gain confidence over time. My father showed me how to read small shifts in their posture, how a slight tilt of an ear or a stare at a certain angle might signal excitement or unease. He repeated that a hunter without understanding of his dog's signals would endanger the entire group. I lived under that roof until age 16 when tragedy struck us. My father went on a contract hunt deep in the northern backwoods, close to the border of another county. A rancher had reported sightings of a large bear that had begun prowling around his cattle, leaving torn carcasses in its wake. My father traveled alone because he believed he could neutralize the animal quickly, but the situation escalated before backup arrived. He was mauled, and by the time they found him, he was beyond saving. The local coroner explained that the injuries were severe. I was told to step outside before they revealed specific details to my mother, who later refused to discuss them in depth. That event changed everything. I dropped out of high school for a few months, uncertain whether I wanted to continue with formal education. My mother, whose name was Linda, tried to hold our family together, but my father's absence left a difficult gap. We struggled with finances. Eventually, we decided to sell the dogs to a reputable handler in a nearby town. That decision hurt me, but I understood we could not afford their upkeep. I refused to abandon my father's craft entirely, even though people in town whispered that I should walk away from that line of work. I felt a responsibility to carry on, since it was the only thing I had ever wanted to do. At 19, I finished earning a GED, and then I secured my first independent hunting contract from a friend who owned a property 12 miles from our place. He complained about feral hogs tearing up his fields, and I worked with another hunter to cull the herd. That success gave me confidence, and over the following years I established a reputation as someone who handled difficult animal control jobs. Now I am in my mid-30s, living in a small house on the outskirts of the same town. I keep 2 working dogs. They are not the same breed we once had, but I have raised them in a similar manner. My daily life involves tracking reports of coyotes, wild hogs, and occasional big cats that wander too close to rural homes. Neighbors sometimes frown on my methods, claiming that I charge too much or that I bring trouble. But I have not seen them complain when a threat is removed from their land. A few of them do not trust me for reasons I cannot fully understand. Perhaps they recall the circumstances around my father's death, or maybe they are uneasy about my solitary ways. I rarely spend time with others except when I must. I prefer to remain focused on my craft, which can be unpredictable. Lately, rumors are circulating about missing livestock. Several farmers on the eastern edge of town say they have discovered torn remains of calves. These farmers claim they have never seen such violent damage before. Some of them suspect a wolf pack or a group of coyotes. I have heard the talk about strange footprints and scattered fur. People have started urging me to investigate. They mention that the tracks do not resemble a normal canine's paw prints, but I have not examined them yet. I want to remain cautious, though. I remember what happened to my father when he rushed into a situation without thorough preparation. I still sharpen my knives each evening, and I keep my rifles in perfect working order, certain that I may have to confront a dangerous creature again. I will not repeat my father's mistake. I wake before dawn, fill 2 thermoses with strong coffee, and load my truck with the usual supplies. I have a scoped rifle, a shotgun, and extra boxes of ammunition. My dogs remain in their kennels for now, since I want to gather information before bringing them to any possible tracking site. I drive along a county road for about 4 miles, noticing that the roadside ditches look deeper than usual after recent rains. The sky shifts from dark blue to a dull gray as I approach the small downtown area, which has a single grocery store, a hardware shop, and a diner that serves pancakes and eggs until noon. I park my truck in front of the diner, step out, and sense the uneasy mood that seems to hang over the place. I walk inside and see a few local farmers hunched over plates of breakfast. They sip coffee and speak in muted tones. One of them spots me, gives a slight nod, and returns to cutting his bacon into small pieces. I greet the waitress, order a plain plate of scrambled eggs, and wait silently at the counter. I notice a poster taped to the wall near the entrance. It shows a missing calf, followed by a phone number. The text mentions a reward for any information related to suspicious activity on farmland. I recognize the family name on the poster. They own a large property on the eastern side of town, about 7 miles outside the main strip. The farmland is known for its high-quality cattle. The waitress sets my plate down. She quietly mentions that the farmers have been losing calves. I tell her I am aware of recent rumors. She adds that the situation has escalated, with multiple animals found torn apart in a gruesome manner. She says that folks suspect a pack of coyotes or perhaps a cougar, but the footprints look unusual. I ask her if anyone has contacted the wildlife department, and she shrugs, explaining that state officials have been slow to respond and appear unsure about the cause. She leaves me to my meal, and I eat without saying anything else. When I finish breakfast, I walk over to the group of farmers and politely introduce myself. One of them, wearing a ball cap stained by sweat, explains that several of his calves were discovered ripped open. He cannot find a logical explanation, but he has heard strange howling at night. Another farmer mentions tracks larger than any coyote he has seen. They wonder if there might be a rogue wolf moving through the area, yet the pattern of the kills strikes them as unnatural. I listen carefully, making certain not to jump to conclusions. I offer my services, letting them know I will investigate for a fair fee. They seem relieved, suggesting that someone with experience might help them sleep better at night. We arrange to meet later at one of the properties where they will show me the location of a recent killing. They insist on paying a substantial sum if I can figure out what is behind these attacks. I sense their desperation. I return to my truck, start the engine, and drive toward the eastern part of the county. As I pass open fields, I see scattered herds of cattle grazing behind barbed wire fences. The grass appears sparse in certain areas due to the season. The morning air feels damp, and the breeze carries a faint smell of manure. I slow down near a long gravel driveway that leads to a wide barn. A farmer stands near his pickup, waving me over. He introduces himself, unlocks the gate, and ushers me onto his property. We follow a narrow dirt path, driving past a row of feed troughs until we reach a pasture bordered by a small wooded section. He parks, and I do the same. We step out, and he points to a spot about 30 yards ahead. I walk beside him, listening as he describes how he found one of his calves 2 nights ago. He uses short sentences to detail the condition of the animal's remains. I brace myself for the sight, but it is still shocking. The ground is soaked in dried blood and clumps of fur. The ribcage appears exposed as if torn by a set of claws. Pieces of hide are scattered. I crouch low, scanning the dirt. I find paw prints that appear wide, with a shape that does not resemble a coyote's or a typical dog's. The spacing suggests a large creature, heavier than common predators found in this region. The arrangement hints at something that moves with a stride unlike the packs of feral dogs I have encountered in the past. I check the nearby fence line and spot more tracks in the soft ground. They lead toward a distant tree line. I walk that way, pausing to study any sign of hair or additional blood. The tracks grow less distinct as the grass thickens, but I see partial impressions. They still indicate a strange size. My thoughts turn to stories I have heard about wolves in these parts, but I find it hard to believe a single wolf could create such devastation without leaving a clearer trail. The farmer stands silently behind me, anxious but unwilling to speak further. I rise, turn to him, and assure him I will do what I can to determine the source of this violence. I remain uncertain, yet I sense that I have stumbled onto something beyond a routine hunt. The prints, the damage, and the unexplained brutality remind me of old legends. But I keep those thoughts to myself. I decide to contact a deputy I know who might have additional reports of missing livestock. For now, the only thing I can do is gather facts and prepare for the possibility of a predator that defies normal classification. As I head back to my truck, I cast one final glance at the torn calf. I feel a heavy responsibility to solve this and protect the town from an unknown threat. I receive an urgent call from a deputy I know named Mark. He speaks in a subdued tone, informing me that 2 young tourists have been found dead at a campsite roughly 3 miles south of the county line. The details remain sketchy, but he insists I drive there immediately. I gather my gear, place my dogs in their kennel, and head out with a sense of dread. The road leading to the campsite is narrow, winding through stands of pine and oak, with low brush along the shoulders. I notice a single SUV parked near a battered ranger station, and I spot 2 squad cars nearby. I park behind the deputy's vehicle and step onto soft soil. The air carries a scent of rotting vegetation mixed with something sharper. I follow Mark along a short trail that leads to a small clearing. Several yards ahead, I see a collapsed tent and scattered belongings. A heavy silence hangs in the area. Mark raises his hand, indicating that I should prepare for a disturbing sight, and I brace myself for the worst. 2 bodies lie in twisted positions. Their clothing is shredded, and the surrounding ground appears stained by extensive bloodshed. One body rests half inside the tent, while the other is sprawled a few feet from the smoldering remains of a campfire. I step closer, ensuring I do not disturb potential evidence. The injuries look extreme, as though something powerful tore through flesh and muscle without restraint. My stomach tightens, and I force myself to focus on small details. I see footprints in the moist ground, partly overlapping one another. Some prints appear large, suggesting a creature heavier than a typical wolf or coyote. The pattern shifts, though. A few feet away, I notice a change in the shape of those prints, as if the paws transition to a configuration that resembles a human foot. Mark leans in, pointing at the same footprints. He whispers that the investigators seem perplexed, and they suspect a wild animal. However, he acknowledges something is amiss. I nod and circle the site, scanning for hair, droppings, or any other sign that could confirm a known predator. I find none of the usual indicators. Instead, I see deep claw marks on a nearby tree trunk, at least 5 feet above ground level. I suspect a creature with unusual reach or strength. Local authorities keep their distance, waiting for the county coroner to arrive. I feel uneasy, recalling my father's warnings about reckless confrontation. The scene displays a brutality I have rarely encountered, and it suggests that whatever took these lives has no fear of human presence. I step away from the bodies, past the collapsed tent, and move a few yards beyond the tree line. I discover additional footprints in the soft soil, spaced irregularly, as if something moved on 4 legs at one moment and on 2 legs at another. The arrangement makes little sense to me. I compare the toe patterns, noticing that the shape does not resemble a bear's front paw or a cougar's pad. It feels unnatural, though I avoid saying that aloud. I turn back to Mark, who stands with his arms crossed. He asks for my opinion. I offer a careful explanation, suggesting that a large predator may have attacked these campers, but I stress that the tracks defy a simple classification. He nods, telling me that the department will likely label this as an unknown animal attack. I leave the official statements to him. I plan to share only the facts I have gathered. Another deputy signals Mark, and I watch them converse in low tones. I suspect they are trying to keep panic from spreading. Campers, hikers, and local families rely on these woods for recreation, and a story about a monstrous creature could shut down the entire area. I slip away, heading back to my truck. I take out a small notebook and record the measurements of the footprints, the approximate distance between them, and the condition of the victims. I note the location of the claw marks, the position of the tent, and the estimated time of the attack. Before I leave, I retrieve my binoculars and sweep the area for anything else that might be relevant. I see thick undergrowth and a faint trail that disappears into a dense cluster of pines. I sense that something might have fled in that direction. The wind rustles the branches, creating a low, rustling sound. I return my binoculars to their case, then exchange a few words with Mark, promising to remain on standby if they need me again. I drive home, my mind churning with concern. 2 people are dead, and the evidence suggests that the culprit may be the same creature responsible for the mutilated livestock. This changes the stakes for everyone involved. I recall the savage manner in which my father lost his life, and I realize that I must proceed with greater caution. I know I have to piece these clues together, but my gut tells me that the usual methods may not suffice against a predator that leaves such horrifying evidence behind. I wake up feeling burdened by what I have seen, and I realize that I need more information about the strange killings. I decide to speak with a few of the townspeople, hoping they can fill gaps in my understanding. I start with a retired mechanic who lives 2 streets away from me. He has spent decades in this area, and he knows plenty about local history. I catch him on his porch, sipping coffee and cleaning a set of rusty wrenches. We exchange a few words about the weather, and he invites me to sit on the old bench beside him. He begins describing a wealthy farmer named Lester. According to the mechanic, Lester owns a large property east of town. People see him at charity events, and they praise his generosity. Yet rumors swirl about him appearing in odd places, especially after nightfall. Some folks speak of hearing howling near his land, though nobody can confirm anything specific. The mechanic mentions that Lester often carries what he calls a lucky belt. Children whisper about it, calling it a charm that wards off evil. Others say it is nothing more than an inherited heirloom. Either way, the mechanic finds it peculiar that Lester always has it near him, even during mundane errands. I thank him and drive toward the local feed store, where small groups of citizens sometimes gather to swap stories. The store smells of alfalfa and livestock feed, and I see a few familiar faces standing near shelves lined with minerals and supplements. When I approach, they grow quiet, likely wary of an outsider prying into their business. Yet they soon realize I am the hunter who has been investigating the attacks, and they relax a little. One woman recounts how her neighbor's goat went missing last week. She found it torn open on a field. Nearby, she caught a glimpse of someone crouched in the darkness, but she could not identify that figure clearly. An older man in a faded cap mentions that he once saw footprints near a creek that ran behind Lester's property. He insists they were not made by standard wildlife, though he concedes he is no expert. Another shopper interjects that Lester has expanded his farmland recently, acquiring pastures that used to belong to smaller ranchers. These expansions took place around the same period that local animals began to vanish or turn up shredded. Nobody has proof linking him to anything sinister, but I sense that people harbor suspicions they are reluctant to express outright. I step outside, my thoughts churning. Lester's name keeps surfacing, and his lucky belt appears central to every rumor. I also recall that my father once shared a story about old tales describing individuals who wore wolf hides or special belts to transform themselves into beasts. I never believed in such claims, dismissing them as folklore. However, recent events weigh on my mind, and I cannot ignore the possibility that something unnatural is unfolding. I continue down the main street, pausing at a used bookshop. The owner there maintains a modest collection of local records and archived newspaper clippings. I browse through binders containing articles about livestock mutilations, unsolved disappearances, and suspicious sightings. Several references to Lester appear in these pages, though not as a suspect. Instead, I see him photographed at community gatherings or listed as a sponsor for local fairs. The timing stands out. More than once, a mysterious attack coincided with a day or two after Lester hosted an event on his land. I speak briefly with the shop owner, who lowers his voice when I mention the recent deaths. He confides that older residents have whispered about a supernatural presence, though nobody dares label it openly. He says they prefer to blame wild coyotes or rabid dogs rather than believe in anything that defies conventional explanation. I realize that this quiet town sits on a powder keg of anxiety, and people want answers that make sense. I leave the shop with a folder of copies the owner lets me borrow. I sift through them in my truck, reading witness statements that mention large, wolf-like shapes roaming farmland, especially in the hours before dawn. One statement describes footprints that appear canine, but abruptly shift to prints resembling bare human feet. Another references a frantic memory of howling that almost sounded like a person crying out. I feel unease tighten my chest, and I recall the campsite where we discovered those young tourists. I resolve to learn more about Lester. I plan to approach him without making accusations, hoping to gauge his demeanor. I want to see that belt for myself, although I do not intend to let him suspect my curiosity. This situation grows more complicated each day, and I wonder how far I should push. I suspect that the answers behind these killings may tie back to the same source that townspeople whisper about. I lock the folder in my glove compartment and take a steady breath. I know my path is set, and I must proceed carefully, keeping in mind the danger of underestimating whatever lurks in these woods. I wait until darkness settles over the farmland. The sky is overcast, hiding most moonlight. I load my rifle with heavy ammunition, then check my sidearm. I bring my dogs but keep them secured in the truck. My plan is to set bait where a farmer lost 2 calves. I position myself behind a low ridge, roughly 80 yards from the bait site. The farmer gave me a butchered carcass. I worry about using such a grim lure, but suspect it might draw out the predator. I stay downwind, hoping not to alert anything lurking nearby. The fence around this pasture is old and flimsy, so I doubt it will stop a determined animal. I wait for 2 hours, listening to faint rustling and the distant hum of insects. Then I spot movement at the tree line. I lift my binoculars and see a large shape, hunched and cautious. My chest tightens as I watch it creep toward the fence. The creature pushes the wire aside with evident force, then moves closer to the carcass. I adjust my rifle scope, uncertain if one shot will be enough. Through the scope, I observe thick fur, pointed ears, and limbs that do not match standard wildlife. This does not resemble a wolf or a bear. It crouches at the carcass, sniffing with a slow, deliberate motion. I exhale and squeeze the trigger, aiming at its flank. The gunshot reverberates across the pasture. The creature recoils and emits a raw sound that shakes my composure. It spins, sprinting toward the fence faster than I expect. I rise and hurry forward, but by the time I reach the wire, the shape vanishes into the darkness. I find bent sections of fencing and a few scattered droplets of blood on the grass. I spot a small clump of coarse fur caught on a barb. My hands shake as I place it in a bag. This is unlike anything I have hunted before. I sweep the area with a flashlight, noticing trampled footprints that suggest an unusual gait. My instincts warn me that this creature moves with intelligence beyond typical predators. I consider following the blood trail deeper into the woods. Then I recall my father's fate. I step back, knowing it would be reckless to track a wounded threat without proper daylight. I return to my truck and calm my dogs, who appear unsettled by the commotion. I store my rifle and bagged fur, then drive home with my mind spinning. Once inside my house, I lock the door and study the fur under a bright lamp. The strands feel thicker than those of wolves. I note their color, a dark gray with patches of brown. I wonder if this sample can be tested at a lab for DNA. Still, I suspect science alone may not explain what I witnessed. Sleep becomes impossible that night. I remain awake, replaying the confrontation in my head. The sounds, the speed, and the silhouette all point to a creature outside standard boundaries. I recall local whispers about a wealthy farmer who owns a belt. I wonder if this ties to that odd object. I feel a sense of urgency, but I must proceed carefully. I decide to wait until morning before telling anyone else about my encounter. Morning brings a haze of fatigue. I step outside to check my truck for damage. I contemplate who might believe my account. I suspect the deputy would listen. But I have few details beyond that fur sample and a vague description. I think about my father's journals again. I recall entries about strange belts and legends of men turning into beasts. My pulse quickens at the thought. I decide to spend the day reviewing his old notes. I retrieve a dusty box from my closet and settle at the table. The first pages discuss standard hunting tips. Then I find fragments that reference a hidden threat in these parts. My father speculated about a cursed item that granted monstrous strength. I read until I realized that I have no easy answers. As I close the journals, I vow to prepare for another confrontation. I refuse to allow this creature to continue terrorizing the region. I will gather more evidence, but I also know I must keep myself alive. There is a line between courage and recklessness, and I intend to stay on the safer side. Yet I cannot abandon these people to face an unnatural hunter. I remain determined to continue tomorrow. I wake to the ring of my phone, still feeling the weight of the previous night's encounter. The sun has yet to rise, and my head throbs from lack of sleep. I answer on the second ring, hearing a frantic woman's voice on the line. She identifies herself as Jessica, a mother whose daughter went missing late yesterday. She speaks quickly, explaining that the child disappeared near a property close to Lester's farm. I promise to arrive as soon as possible, my heart pounding at the thought of a lost girl in terrain that may harbor the beast I encountered. I throw on my boots, gather my gear, and step outside. My dogs watch me with alert expressions, sensing tension. I decide to leave them behind until I have a clearer picture of what I am walking into. I do not want them endangered if I find more than a simple missing person case. I drive east along a narrow highway, passing miles of grazing fields before turning onto a dirt road. The morning sky shows a dull gray, and the wind stirs dust across the ruts. Jessica waits outside a small farmhouse, joined by a deputy I recognize from the station. Her eyes are red, and she clutches a photograph of her daughter. She tells me that the girl, named Holly, had been playing near an old fence line close to Lester's property. Nobody saw her vanish, but the mother heard a brief yell and then silence. The deputy says they searched until darkness fell, finding only a few scuffed footprints near a cluster of brush. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no tracks leading to a conclusive direction. I ask to see the spot where Holly was last observed. Jessica nods, guiding me around the side of the house and across a short field. The grass is still damp with morning dew, and my boots leave impressions. We reach a wooden fence that appears weathered, partially rotted at its base. On the other side stands a line of trees marking the start of Lester's land. I notice footprints in the soft earth, likely from local volunteers who came searching last night. The deputy points to a small depression where Holly's shoe print might still be visible. I crouch, trying to separate old prints from new ones. I spot a faint trail that leads toward the tree line, but it fades quickly. Jessica clings to hope that her daughter simply wandered off. I remind myself that, in most missing child cases, the explanation is more mundane than monstrous. Yet the pattern of recent violence keeps gnawing at me. I survey the tree line with binoculars, looking for any sign of movement. The morning light fails to reveal details beyond the first few yards of undergrowth. I note how the fence behind us holds broken slats, and I wonder if someone or something tore them. I decide to walk deeper into the wooded area. The deputy remains behind, radioing for more volunteers. Jessica follows me for the first few steps, then stops, uncertainty on her face. I advise her to wait near the house in case Holly returns there. She seems torn but nods, returning with the deputy, leaving me alone to push into the trees. The canopy blocks much of the early sun, and the interior feels hushed. I force each step carefully, scanning the ground for prints. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves, or bits of fabric might guide me. I advance slowly, pausing every few yards to listen. Twice I call the child's name in a low voice, hoping for a response. All I hear is a distant rustle, likely a squirrel or a stray breeze. After several minutes, I reach a shallow creek that meanders through the forest. Its muddy banks bear partial tracks. My pulse spikes when I see a few paw-like impressions near the water's edge. They resemble what I found at the campsite. I notice what could be scuff marks that might align with a smaller shoe, yet the prints are too faint to confirm. My mind conjures grim scenarios. I refuse to let panic overtake me, pressing on carefully. Another 10 minutes pass. I push through tangles of brush, scanning for any sign of Holly. Broken branches overhead suggest something large passed by recently. The ground reveals an uneven pattern, partial paw prints that shift into elongated marks. I examine them for a long moment, unsettled by the memory of footprints that changed shape. I photograph the impressions with my phone, feeling the weight of responsibility for a missing child. A sudden noise snaps me to attention. I spin, rifle raised, but see only a fleeting shape dart behind a thick trunk. I rush forward, calling out. Silence greets me. I stand there, uncertain if the shape was an animal or a person. My heart hammers in my chest, and I sense the forest closing around me. I decide not to chase blindly, recalling my father's fate. I will gather help and return with a more thorough plan. I turn around and retrace my path, anxious to update Jessica and the deputy. My gut tells me Holly may have been taken by whatever I encountered before. The footprints, the missing girl, and the lingering presence of something unnatural all align in my mind. I must find her before night falls again. I leave my truck on a back road half a mile from Lester's main gate. I do not want him or anyone else to spot my vehicle on his property. The late afternoon sun throws a weak light across the fields, and I tread carefully along an overgrown ditch that borders a cornfield. I plan to observe Lester without confrontation, hoping to find proof that ties him to the recent horrors. My rifle is slung over my shoulder, and I keep a sidearm holstered at my waist. I recall the night I set out bait for that monstrous creature, and I still feel uneasy. I move toward a cluster of storage sheds near the eastern edge of Lester's land. The ground slopes slightly, offering a shallow vantage point. I spot a pickup parked beside a barn with peeling red paint. A narrow dirt path stretches from the barn into a stand of trees beyond. I see Lester emerge, carrying a burlap bag. He places it in the truck bed, scans the area, and then walks back inside the barn. I remain low, controlling my breathing. A few minutes later, he exits again, now dressed in a heavy jacket despite the mild weather. An old leather belt hangs from his left hand. It looks thick, almost unnaturally wide, and lined with fur along the edges. Its color appears darker than standard leather. He glances around, then slips the belt into the burlap bag. My pulse jumps, recalling local stories about a belt that grants uncanny power. I wonder if this is the same item. I decide to follow him at a distance if he drives off, hoping he leads me to wherever he might keep the child or conceal other evidence. The truck starts, turning onto a rutted trail heading east. I move quickly to my own vehicle, trying to stay out of sight. Once behind the wheel, I maintain a wide gap, using rows of trees and tall brush to stay hidden. My heart thuds as I consider the missing girl and the possibility that she is somewhere deep in these woods. Lester's behavior raises more questions every second. After about a mile of cautious pursuit, he stops his truck by a fenced enclosure. I park behind a line of oaks and continue on foot, cutting across the field to remain unseen. He gets out and takes the burlap bag from the truck bed. With deliberate steps, he heads past the fence, disappearing among the thick trunks. I wait a moment, then follow. The ground beneath the pines crackles under my boots, so I slow my pace, placing each foot carefully. The air smells of damp needles and rotting logs. Sunlight dims beneath the canopy, and the silence feels unsettling. 50 yards in, I see him kneel by a clearing. He removes the belt from the bag. I feel a tense surge when he wraps it around his waist, fastening it with an odd buckle. He releases a heavy breath, then his body starts to shift. At first, I think I'm seeing a trick of the light. His shoulders broaden. His arms look disproportionate, and his posture changes as if he is balancing on the balls of his feet. I observe coarse fur spreading across his hands and forearms. My stomach tightens, and I resist the urge to bolt. He tilts his head back, letting out a guttural sound unlike a normal human voice. In seconds, he appears larger, more bestial, with a shape resembling the creature I shot 2 nights ago. Drool hangs from his jaw, and his eyes seem to reflect what little sunlight penetrates the branches. His transformation looks complete, though he still wears tattered pants around muscular legs. My mind struggles to accept that this is really happening. I grip my rifle, unsure if I should risk firing. He lifts his nose and sniffs the air. I freeze, fearing he senses my presence. He turns his head abruptly, scanning the woods with an alert stance. I crouch behind a thick pine, barely breathing. His elongated claws twitch. He moves deeper into the trees, and I wait until he vanishes from sight. My nerves rattle, but I force myself to remain still for several minutes, worried he might double back. Eventually I inch forward, searching the spot where he transformed. The ground bears deep imprints of his footprints, wider than a standard boot, with claw-like extensions at the toes. Broken twigs lie scattered, and scraps of fabric cling to the undergrowth. I step away, realizing the truth. Lester is the beast that has prowled these woods, killing livestock and possibly abducting that girl. I fear for her life if he still holds her somewhere. My ears pick up a distant snap of branches, and I decide to retreat. Confronting him alone in his transformed state would be reckless. I reach my truck with a swirl of dread and urgency. I must gather any help I can find before it is too late for that child. And I must warn the town that the evil they fear is not a simple rumor. The morning arrives with a grim urgency. I sense that time is running short, and I cannot shake the image of Lester's transformation. I decide to comb through my father's old journals again, searching for any further references to these cursed belts. I find a page near the end, filled with rushed handwriting. My father noted rumors of men who acquired strips of wolf hide that granted them extraordinary abilities, but also bound them to savage impulses. He included instructions for how one might destroy such an item, referencing stories passed down by older hunters. I read every sentence slowly, hoping for a clue that might guide me. I collect the rifles from my locked cabinet and spread them on my kitchen table. I plan to modify one of them with specialized rounds. I recall a footnote in my father's notes mentioning that silver bullets were sometimes associated with stopping unnatural threats. I do not have pure silver ammunition, but I have a set of high-grade hollow-point rounds, and I consider coating their tips with a makeshift alloy that includes traces of silver. I rummage through drawers until I find a small silver chain I once inherited from my grandmother. It feels impulsive, yet I cannot ignore the desperate situation. If the legends hold even a grain of truth, I will take every possible advantage. I melt the chain carefully using an old blowtorch in my garage, mixing the molten silver with a soft metal that coats the bullet tips. The process is crude, but I manage to create a few rounds. I lay them aside to cool, feeling unease at the idea of relying on folklore. Still, 2 tourists are dead. Livestock has been slaughtered and a young girl is missing. I refuse to dismiss any potential solution. Once the bullets are ready, I place them in a separate case, distinct from my usual ammunition. I gather a heavy-duty flashlight, extra rope, and a compact first aid kit. I also slip a small camera into my jacket pocket, hoping to capture evidence if the opportunity arises. I sense that going alone is reckless, so I phone Deputy Mark, the officer I trust most. I speak plainly, telling him that Lester is involved in something beyond standard crimes. He sounds uncertain, but he promises to meet me on the edge of Lester's property within an hour. I head out, driving past fenced pastures and neglected fields. The day feels warm, yet I shiver with anticipation. I park on a concealed dirt track a quarter-mile from Lester's main barn. Mark's squad car pulls up shortly after. His expression signals doubt, but I note his tension. I explain that we must find the child before nightfall. Mark asks if I have proof that Lester abducted her. I confess I have not found direct evidence. However, I describe what I saw: the belt, the transformation, the footprints. He stares at me as though weighing logic against trust. Without another word, he agrees to help. We move carefully toward the barn. Mark keeps one hand near his holstered sidearm while I carry my rifle. The structure looms ahead, its faded paint and sagging doors exuding neglect. We slip around the side and discover a locked entrance. Mark calls out, identifying himself. No response. He tries the handle, finds it fastened from inside. We listen for any noises, hearing only muffled sounds that might be wind rattling the old rafters. We circle the barn, spotting a smaller door off its rear corner. I test it and find it slightly ajar. We step in, flashlights casting narrow beams across dusty floors. My boots crunch debris that might be old straw or scattered feed. The air smells faintly sour. A walkway leads between stacked crates and rusted tools. We progress slowly, scanning every shadow. A soft noise comes from the far end, near a stall separated by a makeshift plywood wall. I gesture for Mark to follow. When we reach the stall, we discover a filthy blanket on the ground, along with discarded ropes. Nearby sits a plastic bowl filled with water. The sight makes me think of captivity rather than a random corner. Mark steps closer and picks up a small shoe. He lifts it into his flashlight beam, revealing a child's size. I feel a tightening in my chest, recalling Jessica's desperate face. Before we can investigate further, the barn door creaks from the other side. A heavy tread echoes across the floor. We freeze, exchanging a tense look. I switch off my flashlight. Mark does the same. My grip on the rifle grows rigid. The sounds approach, footsteps heavy enough to shake the rotting boards. In that instant, I realize we have nowhere to hide. If Lester has returned in his altered form, we are about to confront him head-on. I swallow hard, recalling the special rounds I loaded. I prepare to raise my rifle, determined not to let him slip away. My heart pounds as I brace for the moment he steps around the corner. I grip my rifle and glance at Deputy Mark, who stands a few steps behind me with his weapon drawn. The barn feels suffocating in its silence, broken only by steady, heavy steps. A tall shape appears near the main entrance, moving into the thin shaft of daylight that spills between the warped boards. My eyes adjust, and I recognize Lester, though his appearance has shifted. His shoulders look broader, and the skin on his arms shows patches of coarse fur. His posture suggests the beginnings of an unnatural transformation, yet he remains partly human. He sniffs the air and growls, a low sound that makes me tighten my finger on the trigger. He notices the open stall door where Mark and I have discovered the child's shoe and the dirty blanket. His eyes lock on us. I feel tension coil in my muscles. He raises one hand, revealing long nails that have grown into formidable claws. I spot the belt strapped around his waist, tight against his torso. The effect is immediate. His body starts to shift with greater intensity. His legs bend at an odd angle, and his spine bulges under his shirt. Mark and I step apart, each of us attempting to create a line of fire that will not endanger the other. The barn is cramped, and old equipment clutters the space. My pulse hammers in my ears. Lester roars. revealing teeth that have lengthened into sharp points. He lunges forward with surprising speed, crashing through a stack of wooden crates. I lift my rifle and fire one round aimed at his chest. The shot echoes like thunder in the enclosed space. He recoils, but he does not fall. A pained snarl rattles the dusty rafters. Mark fires his sidearm, sending 2 rounds into Lester's shoulder. We see flashes of blood, but Lester continues closing the distance, fueled by some force that seems immune to ordinary bullets. He swings his arm at Mark, and the blow connects with a thud, knocking the deputy against a wall. Mark's head strikes a wooden beam, leaving him dazed. Lester's eyes fix on me, and he charges with an uneven gait that combines beast-like strength and human agility. I sidestep, scraping my back against the barn's interior boards. I feel splinters beneath my jacket. I manage to cycle another round into the chamber. I aim for the belt, remembering my father's notes on cursed items that channel monstrous power. My bullet strikes near Lester's abdomen. He lets out a roar. Wood shrapnel from a shattered post flies across the barn, and dust rises in choking clouds. In the hazy gloom, I see him grasp the belt as though trying to protect it. Mark struggles to stand, groaning as he regains his balance. Blood trickles from a cut on his forehead. I yell at him to get clear, keeping my focus on the shape towering in front of me. Lester's transformation looks nearly complete, with thick fur sprouting across his chest and neck. His face stretches in a way no normal human face should. His breathing comes in ragged bursts, and every exhalation sounds like a growl. I reach into my pocket for the special rounds I prepared. My hands tremble, and I fumble the first one. I manage to load the second into the chamber. Lester lunges again, slamming into me before I can fire. We crash onto the barn floor. The impact stuns me, and I struggle to keep my rifle between us as he snaps his jaws close to my face. I push with all my strength, feeling the heat of his breath against my cheek. His claws scrape at my jacket. The fabric tears. I fear that I will lose my grip. Mark shouts, distracting Lester for a moment. I use that instant to twist sideways, rolling free from the creature's weight. I scramble to one knee, raise the rifle, and pull the trigger. The shot strikes Lester in the side, near where the belt loops around his torso. This time, his body jerks. A thick spatter of blood hits the floor. He staggers but does not drop. His gaze burns with fury. Mark fires again, hitting Lester in the leg. The creature wobbles, then braces itself against a support beam. I see a chance to move. I step closer, noticing the belt's buckle has partially come undone from the impact. Lester tries to maintain his balance. His shape shifts once more, flesh trembling between human and beast. He shrieks in pain as he realizes the belt is loosening. A metallic creak echoes through the barn. The roof timbers shift from the punishment they have endured during this struggle. Dust floats in the air, turning the light into murky streaks. Lester glances around, sensing that the structure might collapse if we continue this brutal fight inside. He staggers toward the open doorway, leaving heavy prints in the scattered debris. I rush to Mark, who presses a hand to the side of his head. I help him stay upright, then urge him to follow the blood trail. We cannot allow Lester to escape. If he regains full strength, we risk more deaths. Mark nods, grimacing in pain, and we move out into the daylight. Broken boards fall behind us, and dust spills through the open door. We see dark spatters leading across the yard toward the edge of the woods. My heart pounds as I realize this confrontation is far from over. I run beside Deputy Mark through a stretch of open ground, following the dark trail left by Lester. My lungs burn, but I stay focused. We see broken fence posts and trampled grass, showing the path he took as he fled the barn. His blood leaves sporadic drops on the soil. We know we must act before he recovers, because he may complete his transformation again if given time. We move through a gap in the fence and enter a narrow field that extends roughly 200 yards. Beyond that, a stand of pines rises, forming the edge of deeper woods. The sun sits low, casting long shadows across the grass. We pause near a rusted cattle trough, reloading in case our previous shots left us short. I insert another round from my silver-coated stash, and Mark checks his magazine. We have not spoken much since the barn fight, but I see determination on his face. I remind him that if we lose Lester now, he may vanish into the wilderness or return to continue his attacks. Mark nods, pressing a cloth against the cut on his forehead. I see the pain in his eyes, though he says nothing about it. We press on, hearing faint commotion ahead. We pass a small tractor shed, its door open, and I notice footprints and blood smears leading around the corner. I hold up a hand to stop Mark, then peek inside. There is no sign of movement, only scattered tools. We circle the shed, following a dirt path strewn with broken branches. Lester must be struggling from the injuries we inflicted, yet he moves swiftly. My mind drifts to the missing child, hoping we can find her alive. Our path leads us to a gravel road that cuts between two pastures. A group of city dwellers from the area has gathered, alerted by the gunfire and the noise. They approach nervously, holding flashlights and improvised weapons. One man, older and trembling, asks if we have seen the beast. I explain that Lester is wounded and on the run. The group appears frightened, yet they offer help. I consider turning them away, but we have few options. I tell them to position themselves in a line along the perimeter fence, making noise to drive Lester toward the woods. They agree, though anxiety hangs in the air. Mark and I continue forward, calling out for the child in low voices. We step carefully, searching for any new blood drops or footprints. I see fresh scuffs in the gravel heading south. We see additional footprints that belong to no large animal, possibly the missing girls. Our pace quickens. We keep close to the fence line, scanning for movement. The tension weighs on my shoulders, and each minute feels critical. Soon we reach the boundary of thicker woodland where pines tower and undergrowth spreads in tangled clumps. The ground becomes uneven, with roots crossing the path. Sunlight filters through at an angle, forming patches of brightness between wide trunks. We find more blood, splattered against a fallen log. Mark gestures for us to split up briefly to cover more ground, keeping within earshot. I agree, though I remain uneasy about separating. I push deeper into the woods, rifle raised. My heartbeat thuds in my ears. I glance behind me every few yards, wary of an ambush. The undergrowth crackles beneath my boots, making stealth difficult. 10 minutes pass, and I find a small clearing where the grass is pressed flat. I see footprints, the same monstrous shape from before, near smaller shoe prints. I call Mark's name softly, and he emerges from behind a thick pine, breathing hard. He shakes his head, indicating that he has not seen the girl. We inspect the flattened grass, noting signs of a struggle. Mark picks up a torn scrap of fabric. We recognize a child's pattern. Our urgency spikes. We follow more tracks leading away from the clearing, deeper into the woods. The blood trail becomes scattered, as if Lester is losing fluid but still moving quickly. We exchange concerned looks and press on. Suddenly we hear voices shouting from behind us. One of the townspeople yells that they have spotted something large near the far corner of the fence, near a row of old cedar trees. We run back through the brush, zigzagging around trunks. We emerge onto a slope overlooking a hollow about 50 yards below. People stand in a rough semicircle, holding lanterns and flashlights. In the center, we see movement. Lester, hunched and bleeding, crouched beside a figure that appears to be a child. We do not see a clear shot from our position. Mark points to a route that leads around the slope, allowing us to approach from the side. We move quickly and carefully, staying low. As we draw closer, we see that the girl is alive, struggling in Lester's grasp. He appears barely able to remain upright, yet his claws remain locked on her arm. His fur stands out in patches, his body trembling. I realize we must act now or risk the girl's life. I hurry down the slope with my rifle raised, keeping Mark in my peripheral vision. The circle of local residents shifts uneasily, some holding tools and farm implements, others clutching flashlights or boards. They form a loose boundary, preventing Lester from fleeing deeper into the woods. The girl lies at Lester's side, trembling but conscious, her clothes torn at the shoulder. He growls at anyone who draws too close. Mark and I position ourselves behind a thick cedar trunk about 20 yards from Lester. I notice that the belt he wears has come loose along one side. Strips of fur hang from the torn section, and the buckle dangles. His body appears trapped in a half-transformed state, with patches of thick hair along his back and shoulders, but visible human features in other places. He breathes erratically, as though in pain. I sense that his injuries have weakened him. I call out to him, demanding he release the child. He bares his teeth, uttering a guttural sound. I cannot tell if he still understands human speech. He tightens his grip on her arm, causing her to cry out. My stomach clenches at the sight. I gesture for two of the men standing nearby to distract Lester from another side. They wave their flashlights, shouting, hoping to draw his attention away from the girl. Lester twitches, glancing at those lights, but he does not loosen his grasp. Mark steps forward, aiming his sidearm. Lester reacts by lunging, dragging the child a yard across the ground. My pulse spikes. I realize we need a different approach, or the girl will be harmed in the crossfire. Mark lowers his aim, glancing at me for guidance. I remember my father's journal notes about severing the belt from its wearer. I yell at the townspeople to back away, allowing Mark and me a clearer line of movement. We advance several steps, rifles and handguns raised, each waiting for a shot that will separate Lester from the belt without hitting the child. The tension feels overwhelming. Everyone remains silent, except for the girl, who whimpers in fear. Lester sneers as if recognizing the threat we pose. His left arm, covered in dark fur, extends to shield the buckle. He appears locked in conflict with his own body, half man, half beast. Blood seeps from the wounds we inflicted earlier. His breathing sounds ragged. I consider taking a direct shot at the belt, but the child remains too close. Suddenly, one of the townspeople throws a rope around Lester's shoulder from behind, hoping to yank him back. The rope lands, and Lester whips around, releasing the child's arm for an instant. She scrambles free, crawling towards safety. I seize the moment. I raise my rifle, lining up my sights on the belt buckle. I pull the trigger and the bullet slams into the belt's fastener. Sparks fly and fur fragments tear loose from the leather. Lester howls in agony. I see the belt peel away from his waist, the tension released. He collapses forward onto all fours, coughing and growling. Mark rushes forward, grabs the child, and carries her away from the danger. The belt lies on the ground, partially shredded. Lester convulses, his body changing beneath the torn flannel shirt. Fur recedes in patches, revealing human skin. His features contort painfully, returning to a recognizable face. The rope around his shoulder prevents him from rolling away. People stare, horrified and fascinated. He gasps, spitting out blood, and tries to speak. His voice cracks, but we hear coherent words. He sputters that he made a bargain for power and could not control it. He insists he never wanted to harm anyone, yet he could not resist the transformation. He claims the belt was a gift that soon dominated his mind. I see despair in his eyes, and I notice the child trembling in Mark's arms. She appears uninjured, though pale and terrified. I kneel beside Lester, pointing my rifle at him, uncertain if he might still lash out. He coughs again, struggling to breathe. The townspeople converge, forming a ring around us. One older woman picks up the child and wraps her in a sweater. A man holds a lantern closer, illuminating Lester's sweat-drenched face. Mark rubs his head wound, glancing at me. I see the confusion in his gaze, as though he cannot believe what we just witnessed. Lester tries to reach for the belt, but I knock it away with my boot. His eyes bulge with regret. He pleads for mercy, speaking in fits. He mumbles something about the belt's hold over him, describing how it gave him strength beyond measure. Then his voice fades, replaced by shallow breaths. He collapses, limp against the rope. A hush falls over everyone present. The immediate danger appears to be over, but the sense of unease lingers. Some suggest we burn it to erase any chance of future misuse. Others whisper that the belt might hold secrets worth studying. I recall my father's notes, which stressed that cursed objects must be destroyed to prevent their influence from spreading. I decide we should end it once and for all, ensuring nobody else can wield its power. The group agrees, though they hesitate to gather the materials as though the belt might lash out at them. I pick it up by a shredded strap, feeling an unsettling chill in my fingertips. Mark retrieves kerosene from a nearby truck, and we clear a small circle on the ground. We place the belt in the center, pouring a measured amount of kerosene over the fur and leather. Mark strikes a match. The flames curl around it, first with small tongues, then growing into a bright, consuming blaze. A foul smell rises, and I shield my nose with my sleeve. The fur crackles, twisting into blackened strands. The leather cracks, revealing inner layers that peel away in the heat. Sparks fly upward, drifting into the darkening sky. Some onlookers avert their eyes, while others watch, grim-faced. When the fire subsides, only charred scraps remain. I stir them with a stick, ensuring no intact piece survives. Embers glow a dull orange, fading gradually. The belt is gone, reduced to ash. A collective sigh seems to ripple through the clearing, though an undercurrent of unease remains. It is over, yet we cannot forget the brutality we witnessed. Mark leads the townspeople away, directing them to gather near the fence line where the emergency vehicles will arrive. The mother and child ride back to town with a family friend, eager to escape the haunting scene. I linger, kneeling beside Lester's body one last time. His face looks strangely human again, absent the monstrous features we saw earlier. In death, he appears ordinary, as if reminding us that evil can reside behind a calm exterior. It unsettles me to think how easily he hid his secret. A pair of local officials arrive, perplexed by the situation. They see the bullet holes, the rope, and the crowd of anxious residents. They begin asking questions, but Mark and I share minimal details. We plan to file a report that references a rabid animal attack, which is far from the full truth. My mind spins with the knowledge that we faced something beyond normal classification. I recall my father's fate, the legends he documented, and the words Lester managed to utter about his bargain. We load Lester's body into a coroner's van, watching as they drive down the rough dirt road. People disperse, some in trucks, others on foot. The clearing feels empty now, except for the smell of burnt fur lingering in the air. I gather my gear and notice a thin mark on the back of my hand, an odd scratch I do not recall receiving. It stings faintly, though I shrug it off as a scrape from the fight in the barn. In the following days, the town returns to a semblance of calm. The missing livestock incidents cease, and no more bodies appear. People speak in lowered voices about that night, passing rumors about a terrifying creature that has now vanished. I keep my distance, uncertain how to process the full scope of what happened. The child recovers and her family moves out of the area. Mark remains uneasy, though we exchange few words on the matter. I continue my hunting contracts, always glancing over my shoulder. Late one evening, I stand on my porch, gazing at the fields. I notice the faint scar on my hand, recalling the belt and the savage transformations. A slight discomfort pulses beneath the skin. I wonder if some fragment of that dark power has carried over, lingering just beneath my awareness. I close my fist and remind myself to remain vigilant. The belt may be gone, but its legacy endures, and I cannot ignore the possibility that my own life has changed in ways I have yet to understand.